Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. That was a great lunch, correct? Great lunch. So thank you all and welcome to the session, special session that we've got here today, Effective Strategies for Communicating Science in a Policy Era of Alternative Facts. So I'm very happy to welcome to the stage James Weinstein. He is the Dan Cracchiolo Chair in Constitutional Law and Faculty Fellow for the Center for Law, Science, and Innovation at the Sandra Day O'Connor Law School at Arizona State University. His areas of academic interest are constitutional law, especially free speech, as well as jurisprudence and legal history. He is the author of Hate, Speech, Pornography, and the Radical Attack on Free Speech Doctrine, and co-editor of Extreme Speech and Democracy, and he's written numerous articles on a variety of free speech topics. He has litigated significant free speech cases, and he just drove here across from town quickly from doing a 2-hour lecture in the law school to his students, so very thankful that he was able to fit this in. Lawrence Krauss is an internationally known theoretical physicist and author with wide research interests, including the interface between elementary particle physics and cosmology. He is currently foundation professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration and Physics Department at ASU. He is also the inaugural director of the Origins Project, a national center for research and outreach on origin issues, such as the origins of the universe, of humans, consciousness, and culture. Krauss has written 10 popular books and writes for the New York Times and the New Yorker, and as well appears in television and film. And I have to say, the first time I heard Lawrence talk, it was a 45-minute lecture that he gave at the Memorial Union over here, which started out with, we all have much more in common than we think. And then he went for 45 minutes as a storyteller through the Big Bang, through Higgs-boson, through everything, and basically came to the conclusion that we all have stardust in us. And so it was an amazing adventure story. And so I very much welcome them both to the stage here today, and I think we're really going to enjoy this. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Jim? Thank you. You want to begin? You were interlocuting or whatever the word is?
Well, sure. I guess one of the questions we were considering, Lawrence, is whether the false facts regime that we've been in for, well, at least the last few weeks and maybe before, during the campaign, is something truly new, or is it just an extension of business as usual? And I have some views on that, but why don't you?
Okay, you can jump in. It's both new and the same. It's new and extreme. I don't think we've ever seen anything like this where facts are irrelevant in such an obvious way. But it's not new. I think politics is based in some sense on distorting facts in order to convince people to vote for you and then maintain power when you're there. And when you mentioned the question, I couldn't resist but go back to this article from 2004 that Ron Susskind wrote when you may remember when George Bush was president, and he was talking about an aide who I think was Karl Rove, who said that guys like me were in what we call the reality-based community, which he defined as people who, quote, believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. I nodded and murmured something about Enlightenment principles and empiricism, he said. And then he cut me off. That's not the way the world really works anymore, he continued. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too, and then see how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and all of you, will be just left to study what we do. So I think the difference between what we're seeing now, and what was happening then is they had a clear idea that they were inventing reality. This group has no idea what reality is.
I think that's about right. But they, as I understand that quote, you're saying that they were going to do things that is going to change reality. It's almost like the Bob Dylan interview about that it's going to happen real quick, and by the time you know what's happened, something else will happen. That's different than well, first of all, before I talk about this regime, I think it's important to realize that all, as you were alluding, all politicians lie. How do you know a politician's lying? Their lips are moving, and all presidents lie, even the most honest one. Eisenhower, Obama are some of the most honest ones. Eisenhower with the U-2 incident lie. Obama with the if you like your doctor, you can keep it lie. Certainly after a while, it was a knowing lie. So it's not unusual that presidents lie. We don't have to get into all the Vietnam and Iraq and the Johnson and Clinton lying about his sex life. But there is something, I think, qualitatively different about this. As I think you put your finger on it, it's like it bears no relation to reality, and it's almost like the unembarrassed part of it. Like, just make it up because it's convenient. Like, millions of people voted who were illegal aliens and couldn't vote. And just make up the number that will. But
you're absolutely right. But I think the point is that it's not. This is the result of a long process. It's not the beginning. This is possible because this has been led up to for a long time. More and more, the ability to lie with impunity, or not just lie, just to invent information, invent facts, has been occurring. And I think, so what we're seeing is a successful continuation now at the highest levels of government of what's been happening for a long time. And I think largely it's possible because of the internet. That the internet was hoped and is a wonderful source of information, but it is a wonderful source of misinformation. And if you do things right, you can reach just as many people or more people, as we saw even during the election with the phony stories created in Russia and other places. So the internet is a great place to distort information. And what we're seeing is a populace that has not been trained to distinguish. People grew up with 3 or 4 TV stations with the nightly news, and it was filtered, and they were told what to believe, and they could believe Walter Cronkite, and you look at the guy, you could believe him, and suddenly the good news was that you didn't have to get your information filtered. You could get it all. But the bad news was if you don't have a filter, what do you do? And I think that comes back in some sense to education. I mean, we're in a university now, and I think universities and schools are the real culprits, that we're teaching this whole notion of facts. We're teaching science, for example, as if it's a set of facts, but science isn't a set of facts. I mean, that's not it. And too often in school we teach that. It's a process by which you arrive at facts, by which you discern reality from nonsense, and where you can filter out nonsense. And we should be spending more time teaching that process, because the facts you can get from your phone or lies, depending upon what you read. So training students to amass a body of knowledge that's a bunch of facts is just not the way to teach in the 21st century. And if we expect the next generation to be better voters than what's happening now, we have to train them to try and distinguish sense from nonsense. And I actually think this current administration is going to help with that. I mean, the good side of it is we're already seeing it. We're already seeing obvious lies that are caught out. And I think people are becoming more skeptical, not just of the media, not just of academics, but of what they're seeing. And I think that's a good process. And the only thing I'll say about this is that in education, there's a long set of research that says the only way people learn is by confronting their own misconceptions. As a physicist, I face that every day in teaching kids. You can tell them something, but if you do something or have them do something, then they see what they thought was true is wrong. And what may be good is that people are, and I think will happen as long as this administration survives, is that people will slowly be confronting their own misconceptions. They will have accepted something. They'll see on the face of it. They won't have to listen to the media that they don't believe or the academics they don't believe. They'll see it's wrong, and that will begin to generate some kind of skepticism.
Maybe that will work that way.
I'm trying to put a
be
positive
optimistic
spin on it.
about it and Pollyannish. I mean, no, optimistic. No, I agree with you that critical thinking is the solution. It would never happen if people can engage in critical thinking. I have no idea if it's been a suffering from that recently. I see different waves of students over the 30 years I've been teaching, and sometimes they're more entitled than others, sometimes they're better at critical thinking than others. In cohorts.
Well, I think, although I hate to use the word critical thinking, I know it's good in law, but in science, it's a buzzword. It's a buzzword that our new Secretary of Education used. And for many people, that buzzword of critical thinking means don't believe science.
Right.
The people who are creationists use critical thinking as a buzzword. So it's important to talk about what the process of that is. But I agree, I think students, if you ask, I saw it happen during the Bush administration. When that administration started, kids were less politicized than the faculty. By the end of it, they were as politicized. And I think you're going to see one of the things that's going to come out of this administration, I hope, and I think it's already happening, is that young people are beginning to become politicized and beginning to think about the political process and how they can impact on it. And that's always a good thing, in my opinion. So.
Yeah, I wonder what's it going to take to change it. I know what's really disheartening is I know people who are very intelligent and can usually engage in what I call critical thinking, and I'm not going to let people co-opt that word, which is
keep trying.
The essence of, which includes skepticism about everything, including science.
Yeah,
But,
science is skepticism.
Of course it is.
Yeah.
So it's
people, that's, to me, the whole problem of science and alternative facts is that people just don't know what science is. They don't understand that it's constant questioning. Right. As Feynman used to say, you have an idea, you try and prove it right, but then you try equally hard to prove it wrong, and that's what we should be doing.
No, the scientific method is the essence of critical thinking. It's the process. But I think people should be critical of claims that scientists make.
Except the ones that I do, but go on.
Yeah, of course. But the scary thing for me, and I've noticed this for years now, is how people's ideology, people who should otherwise know better, how ideology on both sides, both on the right and the left, distort their perception of fact. It's just amazing to me how people who should know better, and in any other situation would know better, can look at something and see it in such a distorted way. Now you can always ask, how do I know what's distortion? But I think it's been well documented.
We're living in a long period of people talking to echo chambers of their own groups and having very little patience, therefore. And it's really, I'm guilty of this as much as anyone else. It's very hard not to seem patronizing when someone says the earth is flat, okay? I was just getting tweets today about the earth is flat, and it wasn't from the administration, but maybe soon. But I think we are a big part of the problem. This is sort of related to sustainability, so take climate change, for example. So when people hear about climate change, they hear different sets of facts. And so when scientists and academics have been labeled as sort of left-wing, liberal, whatever, and it's largely true, but it's nevertheless, they're labeled as that way as distorting their views, okay? And so when a scientist says, okay, this is the implication, what's going to happen in climate change in 2 degrees or more, or whatever you want to say, it's just a fact that can be countered by someone who says, no, that's not true, and if you trust that person. So what scientists have to do, and again, I don't think enough people are trained to this, is stating the facts. It doesn't help you at all. What you want to explain is how we get to the facts. So if you want to talk to the public about this, you see, the public is assuming that this is a mysterious black box, and different people will come to different conclusions, and it's far too difficult for the average person to understand, and therefore they'll trust the expert that they like. But it's not a mysterious black box, and it's really simple stuff at a basic level. And so what we need to do is say, here's how we come to this conclusion. I was on a cruise. My project led a cruise in Antarctica, and I gave a talk on climate change as seen from Antarctica, where we were and where the West Antarctic ice sheet was falling off. And on that cruise, there were a lot of people from Australia who were part of the mining industry, and of course, those people had been primed not to buy global warming. But what I tried to do was present not the facts, but show them pictures, which were undeniable, but also some simple physics and some simple ideas that lead to this. And it began a conversation. And I think it's the only way that we can really confront alternative facts, is to show that logic and sense that anyone can follow through on their own leads to the opposite conclusion, which once again gets people to confront their own misconceptions. But I think academics are too used to just sort of being experts and saying, trust us. And in this world, no one, I mean, especially with this administration, people have been primed not to trust scientists, which is amazing.
I know, I think what you say about explaining the method and how you got there is extremely important, but there are some problems that are really very, very difficult to explain to non-experts. And also, people don't have the time or to do the deep dive or even the medium dive. So therefore, the trust in experts, including scientists, is critical. And that's why, and the press, which I know more about than I do scientists, even though I know you, it's critical that the people who are experts or are the press are trustworthy, because people can't, because even when you're doing the explaining, trust is important, but particularly when people don't have the time or the expertise to do the follow how you got there. And so there's very little that you and I can do to get this administration to tell the truth. But what we can do is make sure that you can help scientists to be trustworthy and to earn and keep that trust, and I can, and I do with academics generally, and particularly given my interest in freedom of speech in the press being trustworthy. And I have to say that I do think, to some small extent, the mainstream press has contributed to this problem.
I don't think it's a small level. I think the mainstream press has been negligent in their duties since Iraq, if not before that.
Well, I was going to say, going back to the point that you made about a political bias, I think it is true that the academy is overwhelmingly liberal or left of liberal, and same with the mainstream media. Now, take the New York Times. I think it's a grand institution and a great paper, but they are, from time to time, unfair to Donald Trump and have been caught at it. And first of all, it's unnecessary.
Hard to be unfair to Donald
It is,
Trump.
but there is an objectivity.
Yeah.
There is a truth of the matter that even which shouldn't be distorted by our dislike for the many things that dislike. And they have been caught out. They were caught out with the article that they wrote about his ex-lovers. I know that something with the Arizona Republic that I wrote them about, having to do with Bannon, another person. You don't really need to say much bad. You don't need to lie about Bannon to make the case that he's bad. So when I think, you know the expression to gild the lily?
Yes.
Now, I hope I can say this. You know how you shouldn't gild the lily when something's already good? Well, I don't know what the analogy would be. What? Pooping on a stinkweed? If something is that bad, you don't need to lie and make it worse or mislead and make it worse. And to some extent, the press has done that with Trump. I know the Arizona, and I needn't go into the example, but even when I pointed out something to him, I got back from one of the commentators, this guy Ed Montini, he just says, well, but Bannon's really bad anyhow. It's like George Bush saying, well, you know, when he was asked about should we invaded Iraq on the information we had, well, Saddam Hussein was a bad person.
No, but see, I totally disagree in the sense that, I mean, of course, the people are biased, and you got to accept that. But the New York Times, like most other papers, in fact, I think, far too kind in the sense that they played up to exactly I mean, the Times is certainly anti-Trump right now for good reason, but there's, you know, I saw this big story on the Trump boys, and it's just, all it does is play the words. You know, I was in London 2 days ago, and I remember it was with Stephen Fry, and he was saying that there should be a Dr. Seuss character, the Trump ammonia or something, where every time you mention the name, it gets bigger. The head gets bigger. And I think it's just constantly playing because it unfortunately sells papers or sells TV. And I think throughout the whole campaign, there was just far too much emphasis on someone they knew would sell papers. And maybe part of the line was about that, but anything sensational was worth printing because it would sell, and I think that led to the, it's a matter of, in this celebrity-driven era, he was a much bigger celebrity, and people like celebrities, and I think that was a problem.
But that's a different problem with the press. That was a strategic problem with the press, or maybe that is a venal problem with the press selling papers. I'm saying something about that goes back to trust in institutions, and if our democracy is to thrive or even survive, there needs to be trust. And the press is one, and they did, to some small extent, feed into this, to the people, the paranoid people on the right, by not being fair to Trump.
Well, I think look, I deal with the press a lot, and I see this unfortunately happen in science, but it happens more in politics. Then in the current world, the press becomes partners with the people they're talking about, and they have to cozy up to them. And if they want to get stories, and I've seen it happen to science, so we'll talk about that in a second. And so I think there is the fact that if someone is friendly to the press, they treat them better. The press treats them better. And it's a real problem of the press becoming celebrities on their own and having this cozy relationship with the people they're supposed to cover. It happens in science too, especially in a world where where newspapers are contracting, having less money to spend. Most newspapers don't have science reporters, don't have people with any background in science. And so what do? Is it becomes reporting by press release. People from all the institutions here produce press releases because that's, when someone at their institution does research, because it raises the profile of the institution, maybe helps funding, helps donors, all the rest, and then the reporters pick it up and publish the press release, actually, uncritically. And unfortunately, of course, it often gives a misconception about the science, because often it's wrong, or it's not as significant as it seems. And the reporters aren't, maybe politically they can ask skeptical questions, but when it comes to science, they tend not to ask skeptical questions. So that's the one problem. But on the other side, when you talk about academics not being trustworthy, to some extent, if you're interviewed by a reporter, there's a great desire to please them. And so it's really hard, it becomes hard, especially for people new at this, to sort of say, no, you're wrong, or you've got the whole idea wrong, or no, you're misrepresenting me, or whatever. It's just a natural thing to not want to be contrary, and to really just want to go where they want to go. And it's really hard to sometimes at some point, unless you're used to it, to say, no, that's just complete nonsense. Because sometimes for some reporters, that'll just stop the conversation. What I like to tell people when it comes to experts, and a law professor is a good example. I remember one of the earliest times I was, years and years ago, when I first started talking about evolution and in the classrooms, I was on a program in San Francisco, and I was debating this well-known law professor who was a creationist, Philip Johnson. And at some point, I used his trump card, forgive me the word. I just said, look, who are you going to believe when it comes to evolution, biologists or a law professor? Okay, and it was a under the belt blow. But at some point, what I'd like to tell the public is your expert got something to gain? Are they working for Mobil, ExxonMobil, or are they working for, do they make, do the climate scientists, the IPCC, what do they get out of lying and versus telling the truth, versus what does the Koch brothers get by lying about climate change? And so you should say, well, if someone has a lot to gain, you maybe should distrust them more, that expert more.
Or you might even say if someone is, even if they're not gaining financially, if someone is so invested emotionally and ideologically, they may be more prone to see things in a distorted way. I wanted to say about, we talked about science as an institution and the press as an institution. I want to come back a little bit to the academy as an institution and the damage that we've done, or our contribution to the mess we find ourselves now in terms of alternate facts. And that, first of all, it's postmodernism. The fact that postmodernism could live so comfortably in so many departments for so long at the university is a real problem with their notion that everything is socially constructed, including facts, and that all truth is relative. And
No,
what's
your
within
point is right. It's not just the right who are
and
questioning
it almost
reality.
seems as that the alt-right has picked that up as a mantra. They use different words and different jargon, but it's the same kind of feeling. And the other thing that I think has contributed to some degree to the situation we're in terms of maybe lack of trust for the academy, is highly ideological scholarship in, and that's not so much or at all
Happening
scientists,
on
but
physics, but-
no, it doesn't happen. Well,
It's less susceptible.
it's less
but it's a-
susceptible to that kind of behavior, but in more the social sciences, just the ignoring of contrary facts, a distorting misperception and rather misrepresentation of contrary of facts. One of the books that Mick mentioned that I wrote, Hate Speech and Pornography and the Radical Attack on Free Speech Doctrine, was really an answer to the far left and attacking free speech doctrine. And one of the things that I did in that book was to look at the research on pornography and the harm that is supposed to cause. And the only thing I really came away from with that is just how ideologically it was distorted, the research. I mean, I could figure that out. That just if you come into it thinking that pornography, demeaning pornography is corrupting morals and harmful to women, boy, you'll get all those studies and facts that show it. And if you think it's causing no harm, that's exactly what your studies will show.
Well, you know, you were absolutely right in the sense that that we have to be, that academics need to be willing to openly confront poor scholarship in their own fields and other fields. I mean, there's lots of examples of it and that you can look at, and I think that we shouldn't put up with it. It doesn't, and sometimes it means not being politically correct and being willing to call things that you think are nonsense, but being able to defend it, being able to, you know, there's nothing wrong with criticizing ideas. I mean, people are different, okay? I mean, and every now and then people should be criticized, but openly confronting and openly offending is a perfectly, offense is in the person who's offended. They can decide how to respond to it, and they can say, "You've offended me. Here's why," and let's have a conversation about that. But you shouldn't be afraid to. I mean, it's political correctness, which is what you're talking about, I think. And I just tell, you know, I taught for many years at Yale, which was had a lot of sort of postmodernism and it was extremely frustrating. And I think it is an issue that we need to say there is an objective reality. And I'm guided by the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, whose definition of reality was the best. Reality is that which continues to exist even when you stop believing in it.
I wanted to say something about that, to pick up on that, and I want to suggest a distinction between two domains. Mm-hmm. One is the domain that free speech scholars and sometimes the Supreme Court calls public discourse, mm-hmm. where it really is just a chaotic, tumultuous, ideas clashing. And even though the court and others say that the purpose of public debate is to find the truth, it isn't. The main purpose of that is democratic participation so people can have its say. And we want to separate that domain from the domain of science and the academy, and which is dedicated to creation of knowledge, in which there has to be discipline. There has to be people who are saying at a certain point, whether it's a tenure committee, whether it's a hiring committee, no, that's wrong, that's distorted.
Well, I mean, the science is unique, I think, among human activities. That's all science can do. That's the one thing science can do unambiguously, is say what's wrong. Many people think that misunderstand science. They think that science tells the truth. It's never. What it does is it unambiguously can say when something's wrong, when it disagrees with experiment, and you get rid of the wrong stuff, and you're driven closer to what might not be wrong. So I think and that's a problem that reporters have, because they're trained to always sort of find two sides to an issue.
Right.
And that is a huge disservice to the public because, as I tell reporters, in science, one side is just wrong.
Right.
And you can always find a PhD that will say anything that you want. And if you present that as if it's a he said, she said, as if it's an equal side, and that's what's done in evolution, it's done with climate change, because you can always find someone to disagree.
Right.
But you have to present and say, well, it's not really one-on-one. It's 10,000 climate scientists and one marginal bozo, or whatever. And I think, so this effort to find balance when there is no balance,
Right.
when in fact, if it disagrees with evidence, it's just we'd stop talking about it.
Right.
And I don't think that's understood among the public and among the press. And then I think that's a really, really important distinction we have to make. And ultimately, the way you find out is by questioning. And it's good for people to see vigorous debate, because that's the other thing they don't understand about science is they think we have, it's a bunch of people with cloaks who shake hands with secret handshakes. The climate scientists all want to, not reveal the truth because they're here, but they don't understand that to get ahead in science, you get ahead in science by proving your colleagues wrong. You go in every day and try and prove your colleagues wrong, because ultimately, if you can discover something new that some well-held belief is wrong, then you get success in that field. And so it's based on vigorous debate, on skepticism, on not accepting things on faith or on authority. That's the other misconception, that there are authorities in science, and there certainly shouldn't be. Obviously, it's a sociological phenomenon. There are people of eminence, and often they have incorrect views, and it takes a long time. So scientists are people, and can be biased, can lie, can do well. But the institution of science is meant to ultimately overcome that natural tendency in people to want to believe and ultimately to fool themselves.
Right. Now, I wanted to say something, since the First Amendment is what I do. I wanted to bring that in just for a second.
Sure.
Back to those two different domains. Mm-hmm. Within the domain of public discourse, in this country in particular, you can pretty much lie your head off, for good or for bad. There's a recent case where somebody claimed to have won the Congressional Medal of Honor, and he was prosecuted under something called the Stolen Valor Act, and the Supreme Court said either, it was not clear, either he had a right to say that, or more particularly that the act wasn't quite constitutional, it was overbroad. So in the realm of public discourse, or just out in private, talking to your children, or making claims, even as the president, there probably is no legal remedy, and the First Amendment would probably protect people. I mean, look at the abortion debate. Both sides lie on that sort of routinely. And it would probably be wrong if people were prosecuted or even fined for distorting or lying about.
It would be really bad, because then the courts would have to adjudicate on what's the factual evidence in that regard.
Exactly.
And the courts aren't often competent.
Well, there are lots of reasons, including that where you don't want even the courts in this country wouldn't be allowed to adjudicate whether the Holocaust happened. You have a right in this country, and I think rightly so, though it's a longer argument, to say that the Holocaust didn't happen as a member, as a citizen speaking in public discourse. But if you're an historian at a university and you say the Holocaust didn't happen, you should be fired immediately. No, Lawrence, this is important. It's a very important distinction that within the domain of the creation of knowledge, the university and the expert, when we are experts and training experts and trying to create knowledge, there should be lots of constraint on people's speech, be it their scholarship.
Here I disagree with you completely.
Well, but make sure you know what you're disagreeing with. I'm saying an historian who writes an article saying that the Holocaust didn't happen at all, not that only, but just that it never happened. That person has no place at a university than an astronomer who says that the moon is made out of green cheese. That's just not. Now, he shouldn't be left alone in public discourse to say that, but not to say things like that as part of a university.
Well, I think ultimately it's a more subtle question, because, I mean, obviously, the question is what led to the article. I mean, how did the person get to where they're going? Have they a long history? Presumably, they made it through a system of scholarship, which identified some scholarship on the part of that candidate to get to where they are. I think the tenure is an extremely important thing. And if people can be certainly biased and deluded, but if they've gotten to the point of tenure by peer review, you have to be very careful to constrain what they say. So I think people have the right, even in academia, to spout nonsense, but you have the right to, and not only the right, but the obligation to confront them.
Right.
And
No,
say that's nonsense.
I may have overstated.
And I think
I
largely
may
in
have
academia
overstated
that
if I
happens.
said if I said fired immediately. Let's make it a clearer case. Someone comes up for tenure and is writing a thesis that someone who's hired is just a European historian and does a couple competent articles, but his main tenure piece is the Holocaust didn't happen. That person shouldn't be granted tenure. Now, if granted tenure, not for that, but he did normal historical competent work, and now decides to write articles that the Holocaust didn't happen, or that Napoleon won at Waterloo, or that or that the British won the American Revolution, whatever, and he keeps writing articles like that, then I think whatever a ideological neutral rule for firing someone who is doing incompetent work in their field should be applied. Now, I do agree that because something like Holocaust denial, unlike something like Who Won at Waterloo, has a sort of a hate speech aspect, you don't want to bring that in like they probably did when they fired the person at Colorado for some...
I think what you want to distinguish is people who are mistaken and people who distort or fabricate evidence. The latter is case for removal. It's certainly in science.
Right.
And it's happened.
Right.
People are mistaken.
Sure.
Mistaken, and that happens all the time. And I think one has to be very clear. And that's the real problem. Coming back to the issue we're talking about, is distorting evidence openly. Should not be, accepted. And by accepted, I mean we all have an obligation as citizens or as academics to call out nonsense.
Right.
And I think the problem that we're alluding to at the beginning, and you talk about it in terms of political correctness, is the hesitancy of people, including the press, to call out nonsense when it's there.
Right.
And we're now living in, after a long history of being able to get away with nonsense with impunity.
Right.
And what legal mechanisms you provide. Although I think the case, and it's an interesting case, the current travel ban, which I'm allowed to say because Sean Spicer's in here, the case of the courts is an interesting one because basically, as far as I can see, they called out and said, based on everything you said, this is not why you're doing what you're doing. And I found that to be quite remarkable.
Right. Again, though, in terms of legal sanction for false speech or misleading speech, I just want to emphasize, well, first of all, I agree with you. In any domain, we should confront people who are saying distorted things.
Well, today, Flynn has now been resigned, of course, effectively been removed for exactly lying.
Right.
Now, the interesting question will be for me, I just read that, I got the notice from the Times a few minutes ago that Trump knew about this for 3 weeks. And this is supposed to be a good thing, that he's fired him now. But I expect, if I were the press, I would say, why did nothing happen for the last 3 weeks until it was brought public? If you really knew about this, this is not a good thing that you waited 3 weeks to fire him because you were relying on this person as early as 2 days ago when you were framing a response to North Korea's firing of a missile.
We'll have to see the facts on that and whether what he's really being fired for is lying to the vice president.
Yeah.
Not for what he did in
But apparently
Russia.
that it was known that he lied to the vice president 3 weeks ago, and yet this is being used now by the administration to say, look, we've policed ourselves.
Well, we'll find out.
It'll be an interesting question.
But I really did want to get back to something in terms of legal sanction or punishment or discipline for false or misleading speech. I really do think there is very little that the law can do to punish speech as part of public discourse. But let's not mix that up with distorted fact or incompetence in the realm of the academy, which there has to be discipline. That's why we call it, we're working disciplines. There has to be discipline, or we don't create knowledge.
But then you always have this problem of who decides what's. I mean,
What
comes by-
academic freedom tells you who decides are other academics. That's the important thing, that other
We
academics.
can never, and I think I agree with you in the sense that we can never protect people from bad science. We really can't. The law can't do it, and the only way we can do it in some sense is to train people by the educational system, which means the next generation of scientists, but also the next generations of lawyers and next generation of everyone else, is to teach them how to protect themselves from bad science by learning the process of science, learning skepticism, learning how to determine what's likely to be reasonable information, what isn't. And we can never protect people from nonsense. It hasn't happened throughout all of human history. The only protection for that, as I said earlier, is education, it seems to me, is properly preparing people to become useful citizens by training them to be useful citizens, which I don't think, unfortunately, we do well enough in schools, because we have this antiquated system of thinking that we need to get kids out with a certain amount of quote-unquote knowledge, whereas most of the knowledge they'll learn is after they graduate. It really should be the process of gaining knowledge. And what we're seeing now, I think, is just an example of a long history of that.
Yeah, I think there's been a shift in maybe the last 30 years towards that more fact-based learning rather than what I still proudly call critical thinking.
Yeah, I don't know if there's really been I mean, people learn things by rote for a long time, but I think the problem is now that there's just so much information, there's so much going on that it becomes more urgent. I think the problem has probably always been there. The problem, it's just more urgent that we have to train people to distinguish reality from alternative reality than we did before. Because, again, in the earlier stages, everything was adjudicated. There was a press that was very limited. People had access to only filtered information, and now it's an open ballgame.
Certainly, the internet has a huge contributor to this. But an interesting and very troubling, phenomenon is that in this whole campaign, I was talking to friends and relatives who were Trump supporters, and I'd point out the lies, the birther lie. Trump, by the way, was one of the original birther about undermining democracy and legitimacy. And I would point out the lies, but in addition to the very, very, well, let's just stick with the lies. And they'd go, oh, I know. But it doesn't really matter because, and that sort of cynical response is almost as troubling as not knowing it's a lie.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of cynicism. I think, as you say, there's a lot of distrust among everyone. But I think, among the people don't trust the press, people don't trust politicians, and people don't trust scientists. I haven't seen a recent survey. It's true in history, scientists have been among the people that have been most trusted by the public when their surveys done. Ultimately, I think what's going to happen is, as I say, I keep trying to think of a positive spin on this to just keep going. And that is, ultimately, people will just have to decide that they are the arbiters of truth, and they need the tools to do that. That it's okay to be skeptical of everyone. That's not I mean, it would have been healthy to be skeptical of politicians and the press and scientists before. It's just, but then determining a way to determine the truth instead of just saying, these are the ones I like and they're the truth, and these are the ones I don't like and they're not the truth, which is too much of this echo chamber-ness we're in.
The echo chamber is a huge, huge problem.
Is getting people to decide to use the tools of science to become the arbiters of truth, because that's what scientists do. They don't trust their colleagues any more than anyone else. When I read articles in a physics journal, I don't say, well, just because it's published, it's true. A lot of the time I say it's garbage. I read it, and I use the old mantra of the publisher of the New York Times. He used to say, I like to keep an open mind, but not so open that my brains fall out.
Right.
Yeah.
I said it's out of time, but can I have time to clarify one thing so I don't get lots of letters and nasty emails? if there's somebody on campus who is a Holocaust denier and there are cases like this, or a confirmed racist, or I think that they shouldn't be molested, fired, disciplined in any way if a physicist wants to say the Holocaust never happened. That's one thing. What I was saying.
I say anyone who spouts nonsense is equally open to
wait a second.
attack.
What I'm saying is a historian, someone who is an historian, if he makes a certifiably and writes articles on certifiably false questions, then the university does have a role to make sure that that isn't infecting our prime purpose of creating knowledge. Whereas if somebody is in, athletic therapy wants to say the Holocaust never happened, they should be left to their. There should be no university.
I think we all have professions, we have disciplines.
Right.
If we distort evidence or openly falsify evidence in the context of our own discipline, we should be disciplined.
Disciplined. That's right, because we need
I'll buy
discipline
that.
in that
At
context.
some level. Yeah. But it's always the question of, as I say, once again, not having bad opinions or not being incorrect, because all sorts of people are incorrect. It's openly and provably distorting evidence or inventing evidence. That should be subject within the academy to action.
Right.
Yeah.
But unlike in Europe, I think that people outside the academy in public discourse should be free from legal sanction to pretty much lie their head off. It would be better if they didn't, and people should confront it, but I don't think people should go to jail or be fined for the political.
Well, that's the whole point of free speech. I think we agree, is that the whole point of free speech is allowing people to say things that disturb you. And the whole point of free speech is for you to be able to respond.
Right.
The last thing we want to do, because the minute you have an arbiter of truth that's an authority,
right.
The whole point of science is that nature is the only arbiter of truth. That scientists, authorities, bodies, universities are not the ones who determine what's true. It's nature. And by nature, I mean empirical evidence. And that's what we need in society. The last thing we want is the courts to be arbiters of truth, or politicians, or journalists, or in this case, individual scientists.
But again, Lawrence, there's a distinction. We do need arbiters of truth within the academy, in tenure committees and hiring committees. We do need, because it is a discipline, if somebody, in a way that we would never accept in the realm of public discourse, and academic freedom just insists that those arbiters are academics and not political figures or administrators.
Well, you're just talking about arbiters of standards. The discipline should have some standards, and some disciplines do.
But ultimately, it's truth. I mean, does this say something that is factually false, or does it mislead, or is it intellectually dishonest? And that can be sanctioned and should be sanctioned within the university, but not outside in public discourse.
Well, you have a stronger view. I think that something being incorrect happens all the time.
Not good faith incorrect.
But knowing, misleading, distorting, inventing, those are different things than just being wrong.
I didn't mean to say that because someone is wrong. But boy, if we're writing wrong
Because you're
articles,
wrong.
I would, if it were for saying something wrong, I would have never gotten tenure and promoted. But no, not saying something wrong, but for not living the scholar's creed of honest inquiry.
Yeah, people should be able to, absolutely, to the best extent possible, people should be learning a set of ethics, not morals, but ethics when they enter into universities. And the main ethic is to not knowingly mislead. I think that's the main thing we should promote, and we probably agree on that. I see that thing says 0.00.
It did it before. They reset us because you were so good, Lawrence.
Yeah,
But,
okay.
Yeah, and actually, it is time, but we're just going to take a couple more minutes because I just want to ask a question I know that you both had an interest in, and a lot of people out here probably have a concern about this whole idea that many disciplines may be facing potential censorship in government agencies, censorship of scientific data based upon some actions of the Trump administration in the first couple of weeks. And so when faced with a situation where a lot of your work is funded by federal grants, by federal agencies, and now you're facing a situation where that money may be going away, or if you don't toe the line, it might be going away. What about the role of censorship and self-censorship in order to not face or confront that threat from the federal government?
Well, I'll let Lawrence do self-censorship, and I'll say a few words about
Well, I was
actual censorship.
I was going to let Jim speak first on the legal parts, and I'll
All right. I always like to speak instead of
Okay.
you, Lawrence, anytime. Let's say that someone works for a federal agency, and a scientist working for a federal agency, and they are told, don't release this information because it's going to embarrass our view of global warming or something, or make these changes to it before you file that report because it, and then scientist says, no, that's just not true. And learning the ethics, as you called it, of what a scientist's creed, he says, no, I won't do it. And let's say he's fired, or let's say he's releases the information anyhow and is disciplined or fired for that. Does he have any First Amendment recourse? And I think, I've been thinking about this for the last few days, and I think probably sadly not. I could go into the details of the cases, but I won't bore you with that. I just bored my students for 2 hours before I came over here with that. But if you want, I can go into, but there are a couple lines of cases that say they're not government employees within their scope of duty being disciplined for even trying to get their supervisors to do something about a false, in one case, a search warrant that's going to cause a problem, and the person was disciplined. And the Supreme Court said, not our business. If you're within your scope of your duty and you're disciplined, not that you can go to jail for that, not that you don't have First Amendment protection, but we're not going to second guess discipline. And so I think then you have to rely on whistleblower statutes, which I'm told, I don't know myself, told are not very protective on the federal side. And the other cases are, the people like Daniel Ellsberg, who in the Pentagon Papers, and there has been protection, First Amendment protection for the press to, once they get a hold of something that wasn't permitted to leave, to publish it. But all of the indications in these decisions are the person who, against a federal statute or even a federal order, or even probably the instruction of his boss not to do it, there would not be any protection against firing or discipline, sadly. But if you have the case, let me know, I'll take it.
I know we talked about this before, and I think it's really important to point that out, but I think I want to sort of talk about two complementary aspects of this. First of all, I'm a little less worried than some people about this. I know that there were initial statements about the EPA and statements about asking who you were talking to and what meetings you went to, and then they've been since disavowed. I think it is a process of each new administration, in some sense, to get a hold of the bureaucracy and at least try and understand where it's at. And so they basically say, hold on, don't do anything until we find out what's happening and we know what's going on. And so I think we see that even in every administration, they tend to immediately go look at the web pages of the old administration and assess whether they're ready to change them or not. So I worry about people getting a little too nervous about this. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it's not the first time. Of course, it happened it's happened a number of times, but it definitely happened under the Bush administration. It's so much so that Obama had to then openly make a statement that scientists were going to be free to publish their research and speak out. And it's happened in Canada. And what the real danger of this is not that maybe they have no legal recourse. The real danger, of course, is that the public suffers. But more importantly, what you see is the scientists begin to leave government. Because if scientists find that they can't do the research they want, that when they do the research that they're excited about, they can't talk about, what you see is that they begin to not want to work for government agencies. They don't want to advise the government. And that is the real problem, because once the government loses the experts that are there to really provide that information, then they're flying blind. So the biggest danger of this to me is the disillusionment and ultimately the departure of good scientists who are working in federal agencies, who could provide a balance, who then decide that they just can't work within that environment. And we all suffer from that, I think, when that happens. And I've seen it happen a number of times in our country and other countries.
All right, well, thank you very much. Let's give a warm thank you to Jim and Lawrence. Appreciate it. And